Welcome to Standard 2B. Today we will analyze the cultural interactions among American Indians, Europeans, and Africans during the 1600s. Some essential understanding to help us with this standard. Exploration and colonization initiated, or started, or began a worldwide commercial meaning business expansion, and cultural interactions as products and people were exchanged between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. If you think back to your World II class, you can think of the triangular trade patterns that developed between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Products like slaves, rum, sugar, that would be an example of this business expansion and the cultural interaction and products transferred between these regions of the world. The essential knowledge for this standard, a couple of things here. We'll focus first on the Native Americans, and number one here, the settlements of the English in the American colonies along the east coast of the present-day United States, and the Spanish in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America often led to violent conflicts with the Native Americans, with the American Indian populations. This was true with the arrival of Cortez, with the Aztecs in Mexico, with Pizarro and his arrival in South America with the Incas, and up and down the east coast of the modern-day United States with the English settlers in the various colonies as they encountered the Native American tribes that originally inhabited the land. Okay. In most of these cases, the interaction after a certain period of time often became violent. As a result of these conflicts, for the most part, the Indians, the native populations, lost their traditional, their original or usual lands, and fell victim to diseases carried from Europe. So for the native populations, this was unfortunately a two-edged sword. Not only did they lose their lands, they also oftentimes lost their lives in large numbers as well. We see here a map of the Native American population, some of the major tribes and groups that inhabited the land. We see how the boundaries look a little different than the political boundaries we're used to seeing today. Okay, their land was taken by the new arrivals, and also with these new arrivals came diseases, especially things like smallpox. Smallpox was a disease that had a lot of people in Europe, Africa, and Asia had developed immunities to, but the Native American population had no natural defenses against this disease, and as a result, it just tore through these populations, killing large numbers. We see as an example here the Native American population of central Mexico. Here in 1520, roughly 30 years after the arrival of Columbus in the Americas, was around 25 million people. And about 80 years later, that population had declined over 95% down to about 1 million people. Most of that decline can be attributed to these diseases that just tore right through these populations. So we want to know that about the interactions. Okay, one contrast to the Spanish and the English on this were the French. By contrast, French exploration of Canada, it didn't lead to large-scale immigration from France. In other words, the Spanish and the English, large numbers of people came from those countries to settle in the New World. France, the land they controlled, did not attract similarly large numbers of people. And as a result of that, the relations with the native peoples were generally friendlier. They were more cooperative. Okay, we can think of it this way, that in the pink and the orange areas where the English and the Spanish settled, the relations were generally unfriendly, generally resulted in violent conflict. In contrast, in the blue areas where the French settled, okay, in Canada, down through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River Valley, because of fewer people coming from France, okay, there was generally a more cooperative and friendly relationship. Okay, the French weren't coming over and setting up big towns and cities like the English and the Spanish were. They weren't bringing over large families. By and large, the French were just sending over single men who were fur traders, and their economic interest and their sort of cultural way of looking at the land lined up more closely with the Native Americans. Okay, so the French were a contrast to the English and the Spanish in terms of their relations, for the most part, with the native peoples. Okay, we also want to know a little here about the interactions with Africans. Okay, we want to focus here on Jamestown and the arrival of the first Africans brought against their will across the Atlantic Ocean in the hull of slave ships. Okay, you learned about the Middle Passage, the horrendous conditions in which people were transported from their homes in Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the Western Hemisphere. The first people taken aboard as slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619, which, if we do the math, is just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown. Okay, and they were largely put to work on plantations. Plantations were large farms that usually used slave labor. They were so large, it took large supply of people working the land. And in Virginia, these plantations largely grew the cash crop of tobacco. We see in this advertisement from the time period advertising Virginia tobacco. Okay, and we see the plantation owner and the slaves in the field and the tobacco being grown and smoked. Okay, this was sort of the economy that developed here on these plantations. It's that combination of it being an agricultural or a farming economy and a mercantile economy. You might recall from your World II class the term mercantilism, which was the economic system of the day where countries were trying to become self-sufficient. They wanted to produce and make everything themselves without having to trade with other countries. Okay, those economies were based on large plantations, large holdings of land in the southern colonies and the Caribbean. Okay, and then the subsequent trade in New England of slaves and rum. Okay, the New England colonies were very heavily involved, okay, in the slave trade, and that sort of cycle of that economic cycle led to the rise of an enslaved labor force, a large number of people being used as slaves. We see here in this graph of slavery in Virginia during the 17th century, during the 1600s, from the arrival of the first slaves at Jamestown in 1619, and fast forward about 80 years to 1700, we see the number of people who were slaves in Virginia rise very rapidly to 10,000 by 1700. Keep in mind, this chart is just for Virginia. This isn't the total number of slaves in the American colonies. It's not taking into account other colonies other than Virginia. And those are the main things we want to know for Standard 2B.